Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. I'm Alex, and today I'm joined by Eve to explore some really interesting ideas about the history of science. You ready to dive in?
Absolutely, Alex. Let's go.
So today we're going to be looking at the relationship between religion and the rise of natural science, which is a topic that often sparks debate and can be really misunderstood.
It really can. There are so many assumptions out there about science and religion being at odds, but when you look at the history, you see a much more nuanced picture.
Exactly. And to help us understand this complex relationship, we'll be looking at Peter Harrison's book, The Bible, Protestantism, and the Rise of Natural Science. Harrison's a leading historian of science and religion, and his work really challenges some conventional thinking on this topic.
Yeah, he really does pose a question that might surprise some people. Did religion, and specifically Protestantism, actually play a key role in the scientific revolution of the 17th century?
That's a big question, and it kind of goes against what many people assume about the history of science. So, Eve, let's start unpacking this. What's Harrison's main argument here?
Well, Harrison argues that the Reformation, with its emphasis on sola scriptura, that is the idea that the Bible alone is the ultimate source of religious authority, had a profound impact on how people approach the study of nature.
Interesting. So, how did focusing on the Bible lead to changes in scientific thinking?
One key aspect was the shift towards a more literal interpretation of Scripture. As Harrison puts it, the Reformers' insistence upon the perspicuity of Scripture encouraged a direct and unmediated encounter with the biblical text. This meant that people were encouraged to read and interpret the Bible for themselves without relying solely on traditional interpretations from the church.
So, a more individualistic and text-focused approach to faith. But how does that connect to the study of nature?
You see, if the Bible is seen as the ultimate source of truth, and the Bible describes the natural world, then understanding the natural world becomes a way of understanding God's creation and therefore God himself.
Ah, I see. So nature becomes like a second book, a testament to God's power and wisdom alongside the Bible.
Precisely. And this idea of the book of nature became very influential in shaping early scientific inquiry. Many natural philosophers at the time, deeply devout in their faith, saw their work as deciphering God's handiwork in the natural world.
That's a beautiful way of looking at it. Studying nature became a form of worship, a way of getting closer to God.
Exactly. And this religious motivation, coupled with the Protestant emphasis on literal interpretation, it contributed to a more meticulous and systematic approach to observing and documenting the natural world.
So instead of just accepting traditional interpretations of nature, there was this new drive to carefully observe and study it firsthand. It seems like a shift toward what we now call the scientific method.
You're absolutely right. And Harrison points out that this shift wasn't an overnight revolution, but a gradual process. He writes, the process by which natural philosophers came to embrace observation and experience was a complex one, and it would be misleading to suggest that there was a single moment at which the scales fell from their eyes and they were suddenly converted to empiricism.
Makes sense that such a fundamental shift in thinking would take time and involve many factors. So while the Reformation was a crucial catalyst, it wasn't the only thing driving these changes. What else was going on?
Another significant factor was the rediscovery of ancient Greek texts, particularly those dealing with natural philosophy. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle had a profound impact on how Europeans viewed the natural world.
It's interesting how these ancient ideas rediscovered during the Renaissance sparked new ways of thinking about the world. Do these ancient texts always agree with the prevailing Christian worldview?
Well, not necessarily. In fact, Harrison argues that some of these texts, especially the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of ancient writings attributed to the mythical figure Hermes Trismegistus, introduced ideas that were somewhat at odds with Christian theology.
So how did people reconcile these potentially conflicting ideas? Did they just ignore the parts that didn't fit their worldview?
Not quite. Harrison explains that these texts were often interpreted through a Christian lens, finding ways to harmonize them with existing beliefs. For instance, the concept of a divine craftsman found in Plato's Timaeus resonated with the Christian idea of God as the creator.
So they were weaving these different intellectual threads together, finding common ground between ancient philosophy and Christian theology. It sounds like a very dynamic and intellectually stimulating period.
It was indeed. And this intellectual ferment laid the groundwork for a major shift in understanding the very concept of nature itself.
Okay, now that's intriguing. We often take the word nature for granted, but you're suggesting it had a different meaning back then.
Exactly. Harrison explains that before the rise of modern science, the dominant way of understanding the universe was through the concept of cosmos. And cosmos wasn't just another word for the universe, it carried a whole set of philosophical and theological assumptions.
So what did cosmos represent for people back then? How was it different from our modern understanding of nature?
Cosmos implied order, harmony, purpose, and even beauty. It was a universe designed by a divine hand where everything had its place and meaning. Harrison describes it as a world of symbolic correspondences where the heavens declared the glory of God and earthly things pointed beyond themselves to their heavenly archetypes.
So a very different picture from our modern, more secular view of nature.
Precisely. And what's crucial here is that the gradual replacement of cosmos with the more modern notion of nature was a key step toward the rise of natural science.
So how did that shift happen? And why was it so important for the development of science? Well, how did this shift from cosmos to nature pave the way for a more scientific understanding of the world?
Well, nature as it came to be understood was a more neutral concept, less inherently tied to divine purpose or a preordained hierarchical order. Think of it this way. Cosmos was something to be contemplated and admired, while nature was something to be investigated and understood through observation and experimentation.
So a shift from a universe imbued with inherent meaning and symbolism to a world that could be objectively analyzed and measured.
Exactly. And this new way of seeing nature was further reinforced by the emphasis on observation that came with the rise of natural history. Naturalists like John Ray were meticulously documenting the characteristics of plants and animals, focusing on their physical attributes and behaviors rather than, their symbolic or allegorical meanings.
So let's focus on what a plant or animal might represent in a religious or philosophical sense, and more on what it actually is and how it functions in the natural world.
Precisely. Harrison quotes Ray as saying, "The history of nature is so very large a subject that no one man can pretend to a perfect understanding of it. Besides, life is so short and time so swift that a man can scarce attain to the knowledge of any one part of it." This quote really captures the spirit of the time, a sense of awe at the vastness and complexity of the natural world, coupled with the determination to understand it through careful observation.
It's like they were switching from reading about nature in theological texts to writing their own books based on direct experience and observation.
That's a great way to put it. And this shift towards a more descriptive and observational approach to nature was deeply intertwined with the Reformation's emphasis on sola scriptura.
Okay, let's circle back to that. How did the Protestant focus on the Bible specifically contribute to this shift towards observation in the study of nature?
Well, Harrison argues that the Protestant rejection of allegorical interpretations of Scripture played a significant role. With the focus now on the literal meaning of the Bible, people were encouraged to look at the natural world in a similar way, to see it for what it is, rather than through the lens of pre-existing interpretations or symbolism.
So if the Bible was to be understood literally, then the book of nature should be read literally as well.
Exactly. And this literal approach to nature, combined with the growing importance of observation in natural history, created a fertile ground for the development of a more empirical mindset.
It's fascinating to see how a theological shift like the Reformation could have such a profound impact on the trajectory of scientific thought. It challenges the idea that religion was simply a barrier to scientific progress.
It really does. And this shift in thinking about nature wasn't just happening in isolation. The exploration of new lands and the discovery of new species also played a significant role in pushing people to rethink their understanding of the world.
Yes, we were talking about that earlier. While all these intellectual changes were happening, Europe was experiencing a literal expansion of its known world through exploration and discovery. How did encountering new continents and new life forms contribute to this changing view of nature?
Imagine setting sail for uncharted territories and encountering a continent teeming with plants and animals that you've never seen before. These discoveries were mind-blowing, forcing scholars to confront the limitations of their traditional understanding of the world.
It's like finding out that your textbook is missing entire chapters. Suddenly, the world was revealing itself to be far more vast and complex than anyone had previously imagined.
Exactly. And this realization had a huge impact on the development of science. It led to the emergence of entirely new scientific disciplines like botany and zoology, dedicated to classifying and understanding all this newfound biodiversity.
So new fields of study were born out of the necessity to make sense of all these new species.
Precisely. But it wasn't just about cataloging new life forms. These discoveries also prompted a reevaluation of humanity's place in the universe. The concept of anthropocentrism, the idea that humans have a unique position and special capabilities within the natural order, gained traction during this period.
So a shift from seeing humans as part of a divinely ordained cosmos to a view that emphasizes human agency and our ability to understand and even control the natural world.
Exactly. And this new sense of human agency and intellectual power fueled further scientific inquiry. Thinkers began to see themselves not just as passive observers of God's creation, but as active investigators capable of unlocking the secrets of nature through observation, experimentation, and reason.
It's remarkable how all these factors, the Reformation, the rediscovery of ancient knowledge, and the expansion of the known world, converge to create such a fertile ground for scientific progress. But there's still the question of how these new scientific discoveries were reconciled with religious beliefs. Was there a sense of conflict, or did people find ways to integrate these new findings into their existing worldviews?
That's a key question, and Harrison provides some insightful answers. He argues that, contrary to the popular narrative of inherent conflict, many thinkers of this era sought to harmonize their scientific findings with their religious convictions. They weren't necessarily seeing science and religion as mutually exclusive, but rather as different ways of understanding the same reality.
So instead of rejecting scientific findings outright, they were looking for ways to integrate them into their existing belief systems.
Exactly. And one of the key concepts that emerges here is the principle of accommodation. This idea, which had roots in earlier theological discussions, suggests that God tailors his communication to human understanding. In other words, God speaks to us in a way that we can comprehend, even if it's not the complete or absolute truth.
So this principle was used to interpret both scripture and scientific discoveries.
Precisely. For instance, certain biblical passages describing natural phenomena were understood figuratively, while others were seen as potentially aligning with new scientific discoveries. This suggests that there was an ongoing dialogue between science and religion, which Harrison argues is crucial to understanding the rise of modern science.
That's an incredibly important point. It reframes the whole conversation about the relationship between science and religion. Instead of this constant warfare that we often hear about, there was a dialogue, a search for common ground, and a willingness to reinterpret traditional understandings in light of new discoveries. You've got it. And Harrison argues that this dialogue was a crucial factor in shaping the development of natural science. It wasn't a clean break from religious thought, but a complex and nuanced interaction that ultimately contributed to the rise of modern science as we know it.
This has been incredibly insightful, Eve. It feels like we've only scratched the surface of this complex and fascinating topic.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
It feels like we've uncovered a whole new way of looking at the relationship between science and religion. So to bring it all together, what's the key takeaway from Harrison's book? What should we be rethinking about this historical narrative?
Well, Harrison's central argument is that the Reformation, particularly its emphasis on sola scriptura and a more literal interpretation of the Bible, actually created conditions favorable to the rise of modern science. This challenges the traditional view of a conflict between science and religion, showing how intertwined they were in this crucial period. It's a powerful counter-narrative. It suggests that certain religious ideas perhaps unintentionally paved the way for a more empirical and observational approach to understanding the natural world.
Exactly. One of the things Harrison emphasizes is the way that the Reformation fostered a new sense of individual responsibility for interpreting both Scripture and the book of nature. People were no longer solely reliant on the interpretations of church authorities. They were encouraged to read and study for themselves, and this had a profound impact on how they approached the study of nature.
So this individualistic approach to faith, where people were encouraged to engage directly with the Bible, also led to a more direct engagement with the natural world.
Precisely, Harrison argues that this shift towards individual interpretation, combined with the focus on the literal meaning of Scripture, created a climate where observation and experimentation could flourish.
It's fascinating to see how these seemingly theological changes could have such practical implications for the development of science. Are there any specific examples from the book that illustrate this connection between Protestant ideas and scientific practice?
Absolutely. Harrison delves into a number of fascinating case studies. One that stands out is his discussion of the English naturalist John Ray, who we mentioned earlier. Ray was a devout Protestant, and his approach to natural history was deeply informed by his religious beliefs.
Okay, so how did Ray's faith shape his scientific work?
Well, Ray believed that the study of nature was a way of glorifying God and appreciating the wonder of his creation. In his book, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation, Ray argues that the intricate designs and adaptations we see in nature are evidence of God's intelligence and power.
So for Ray, studying nature was a way of understanding God's design. Sounds almost like a form of theological inquiry.
Exactly. And this religious motivation drove Ray to meticulously document and classify the natural world. He was a pioneer in the field of taxonomy, developing systems for categorizing plants and animals based on their physical characteristics.
So his desire to understand God's creation led him to make significant contributions to the scientific understanding of nature. It's a powerful example of how religious belief and scientific inquiry could work hand in hand.
It really is. And Ray wasn't alone. Harrison discusses a number of other natural philosophers who saw their scientific work as a form of religious devotion. This challenges the assumption that science and religion were always in conflict.
It seems like, at least in this period, the two were deeply intertwined. And
Yeah.
what about the idea of accommodation that we talked about earlier? How did that play out in the relationship between science and religion?
Well, the principle of accommodation was used to address potential conflicts between scientific discoveries and biblical interpretations. For example, as astronomers began to challenge the traditional geocentric view of the universe, some theologians used accommodation to argue that certain passages in the Bible describing the sun's movement should be understood figuratively rather than literally.
So they were finding ways to reconcile new scientific knowledge with their faith by reinterpreting certain biblical passages. It sounds like a very flexible and dynamic approach to Scripture.
It was. And this flexibility, Harrison argues, was crucial for allowing science and religion to coexist and even support each other during this period. It prevented a rigid adherence to literal interpretations from becoming a barrier to scientific progress.
It's really fascinating to see how these seemingly disparate ideas, the Reformation, natural history, biblical interpretation, and even the discovery of new worlds, all converge to shape the rise of modern science.
Absolutely. Harrison's book provides a rich and nuanced account of this complex historical process, challenging many of the assumptions we often hold about the relationship between science and religion.
This deep dive has certainly been an eye-opener. Eve, I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the complex interplay between these two domains. And it makes you wonder what other historical narratives might need revisiting in light of these new perspectives.
It's a great question. I think Harrison's work reminds us that history is never as simple as we often assume. It's full of unexpected connections and surprising influences that challenge our understanding of the past and present.
Well, Eve, thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me and for sharing your expertise on Peter Harrison's work. I highly recommend this book to anyone interested in exploring the fascinating and often misunderstood relationship between science and religion.
It was a pleasure, Alex. And for our listeners, if you want to explore these ideas further, be sure to check out Peter Harrison's The Bible, Protestantism, and the Rise of Natural Science.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.